moderator, speakers, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Dr. Mohammed Al-Ali, Director General of Trends Research Advisory, I welcome you all to our first annual Political Islam e-Forum, Path to Caliphate, the truth behind Muslim Brotherhood project. This evening's event is the first of the 5 symposium as part of this new series. The topic of today's symposium is the ideological foundation of Muslim Brotherhood, misrepresentation and manipulation. The idea of political Islam as practiced by organizations such as the Muslim Brotherhood has divided thinkers, experts, and decision makers for years. For years, the Muslim Brotherhood has misused matter of faith to create a rift among the followers of a religion of peace and caused havoc in society. Even as we battle a pandemic and an economic slowdown, it is important to keep an eye on the socio-political streams that have often been source of conflict and even terror in the region. It is perhaps even more important today to learn from the Muslim Brotherhood's past so that such mistakes are not repeated in the future. For this reason, we have among us today well-known experts on political Islam and Muslim Brotherhood. I welcome you all and we look forward to your presentations and the discussion. Thank you very much, dear Tal. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Arifa. Hello, everyone. It is definitely my pleasure to be part of today's E-Symposium under the title Path to Caliphate, the truth behind a Muslim Brotherhood project. In this session, in this discussion today, we're going to break down the implementation through, as an Israeli journalist, I have to tell you that I'm first very excited to take part in this discussion. And second, I find it very intriguing and interesting, the timing in which Trends chose to tackle this topic. Recently, the global attention and the world news agenda, I can tell you, has, when we think about its dedication to the Middle East region right now, then in recent weeks, we've seen much focus on the peace accords between Israel, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, but at least on this side of the world where I am right now in the United States, I haven't seen much attention being given to the ramification of these peace accords and what it means for the Muslim Brotherhood, its offshoots, and its partners in Turkey and Qatar. I have seen much attention and much debate about what it means for Iran and the Palestinians. And one more thing that I wanted to say before we begin, tonight at 9 p.m. Eastern time, as you all follow the US presidential race, the first presidential debate in the campaign will take place between President Trump and former Vice President, Democratic candidate Joe Biden. We know that the reading of the Middle East map and the US interest in the region is very different. But one thing that we can say about both of them, I guess, unfortunately so far, is that none of them has recognized the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. We know that President Trump is considering it. Maybe, who knows, he might do it if he is reelected and wins a second term. So we will discuss what it means, what could we see happening next regarding the Brotherhood, but we also want to backtrack a little and begin with some background. So let's get right to it. And to hear about the ideological roots of the Brotherhood and analyze the movement's journey until modern time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker for today, Dr. Mohammed Farid Azi. He is a researcher and expert in political sociology and opinion polls at Trends Research and Advisory. He's joining us from the UAE. Thank you so much, Dr. Azi.
Thank you very much, Ms. Henrik. Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure as well to be among this panel of distinguished scholars to discuss an important topic for our region and for the peace and stability in the world. And that is of the political Islam in general and the Muslim Brotherhood in particular. There is one fact to start with, is that the Muslim Brotherhood has failed in its ruling experience. And that is for many reasons, in fact. One of the reasons that we'll be focusing on today is to do with its discourse, it's to do with its ideology. Because it has failed to meet the requirements of authority, of governance, according to modern concepts. And according to the national state and citizenship requirement. The demise of the Muslim Brotherhood is also reflected in many other indicators. And some indicators that we possess is to do with the public opinion, general public opinion in the Arab countries. And one of the famous, reliable indicator is the Arab Barometer surveys that have been going on for almost 16 years. And they were asking this question on the popularity of the parties who are Islamic or the Brotherhood as such. There's a question about the trust in Brotherhood. And since from 2006, the first survey, now they are in the fifth wave to last year, 2019, the popularity of the Muslim Brotherhood fell dramatically from an acceptance of 47% to last year's 19% only. That means 2 in 10 people only would trust Muslim Brotherhood, and only 5%, almost 5.8% would trust it strongly. Okay, what does indicate for us? For this first session, we would be, as I said, focusing on one dimension of the reasons of the Muslim Brotherhood demise, and that is, as I said, to do with its ideological and intellectual project. In order to do that, we'll have maybe to go back in history, because the conceptual foundation and ideas of the Muslim Brotherhood are gathered a little bit from different traditions and school of thoughts and Muslim thinkers. Of course, this is not an easy task in 15 or 20 minutes, as it covers a lot of ground in our history. So it evidently is going to be a flow over some constitutive epochs and traditions from which the Muslim Brotherhood drew its fundamental ideological constituent. Now, I would like to share with you the rest of my presentation, if you allow me. Can you see it?
Yes, I do.
Great. I would like to start with some introductory remarks, in fact, which are to do with the features of the Muslim Brotherhood thought. The first remark is that conceptual armada or conceptual constituent of the Muslim Brotherhood, in its core, it has not changed. In its fundamental convictions, it has not changed. It has changed. Maybe it has evolved, the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, in its periphery. In its periphery, it has changed, but fundamentally, it has not. And till the arrival of the Muslim Brotherhood to power in 2012, they were still talking about using the same vocabulary as their classical Islamist discourse. Using slogans like, or ideas like the revival of the Caliphate, the mastery of the world, study al-alam, etc. Another characteristic of their intellectual production is that it lacks intellectual diligence. Another feature, it is selective. It uses from the Islamic heritage, old or modern, what really fits its political objectives. Another remark is also that this discourse lack in theorizing. Since the death of the founder, Hassan al-Banna, none of the general guides, there had been 7 after him, have offered any innovative additions. We had to wait from the death of Hassan al-Banna in 1949 till the late 50s, beginning 60s, that we had the second theorist in the name of Sayyid Qutb. From that on, we can count the intellectual, between brackets, of the Muslim Brotherhood on the, as they say, the fingers of one hand. Also, as we mentioned before, that the discourse has not changed significantly since it was proclaimed by Hassan al-Banna over 80 years ago, namely using the same principle: Islam is a comprehensive and self-contained system, the ultimate root of life in all its aspects. Islam is based on two sources, the Quran and the Sunnah. Islam is applicable everywhere and in all time. We can add to this concepts like the Khalifa, the use of force, jihad, and so forth and so on. And also, what can characterize that strain of thought is it is syncretic. It's syncretic. The Muslim Brotherhood chooses its idea from Islamic thought, both traditional and modern. The first stream of thought goes as far back as the Islamic classical heritage, from the 1st to the 5th century in the Hijri calendar. The second main source of the Muslim Brotherhood intellectual project, if you may say, it's the Nahda intellectuals represented by Jamal al-Din Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and especially Muhammad Rashid Rida. And to some extent, contemporary writers from the subcontinent, the Indian subcontinent, like the theorist Abu al-Ala al-Mawdudi, which especially influenced the writing of Sayyid Qutb in particular. So, if we start from the first strain, we would say that the Muslim Brotherhood has a political reading of the Quran, and also to the Islamic intellectual heritage. We just give some examples as how they use Quranic vocabulary and give its different contents. We have a main concept like the concept of Tawheed or oneness. Originally in the book, it refers to transcendence, the uniqueness of God. As applied by different Islamist organizations, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, it has been reinterpreted to mean unity of society, unity of the Ummah, etc. A concept like Shura, also originally it means an advisory council, not mandatory, but it has been used in their vocabulary as well. The concept of Ummah, the concept of Hizb, which has different meaning in the Quran. The word of Jahiliyyah as well, it's used, but as it's used by Sayyid Qutb, it has a different meaning. Hakimiyya, sovereignty. So the first attempt was done to read the Quran the way they wanted, the way politicizing already the conceptual framework, conceptual or main concepts in the Quran. Jihad as well, we will discuss it later on, which has a different meaning as been used by either the different Islamic fractions and the Brotherhood as well. Here you have a different general scheme of the outline of Muslim Brotherhood political visions. The main concept there, starting with the inclusiveness of Islam, divine governance or divine sovereignty, concepts like Jahiliyyah or Takfir, Jihad and force, Islamic Caliphate. These are, in fact, briefly speaking, the main ideas. Then, if we go further a little bit to the classical Islamic epoch, where the intellectual Salafism has been constituted, really. Because the Salafist legacy is the line of thought that links Muslim Brotherhood ideology, MB in abbreviation, to the early Islamic thought. So the Islamist movement, including the Muslim Brotherhood, drew its religious culture from this Salafist environment. Many of the leaders of this, the early Salafists, had differences and conflicts with the ruling authorities as well. Example like Ibn Hanbal with the Abbasid rulers, Ibn Taymiyyah with the Mamluks in Syria, etc. Right. The name Ibn Hanbal is sometimes mentioned, but the influence is indirect, in fact. Ibn Hanbal, what he did, he set the epistemology and the method of Salafism, which is literally reading of and commitment to the source, Quran and the Hadith. He set a method of thought that was, of course, challenged at that time by the Mu'tazilit, and we all know the big disputes that happened at that time, and the whole different epistemologies, in fact, the Mu'tazilit relying on reason, and Ibn Hanbal relying on imitation and transmission, and naql wal-aql. Ghazali came later on, Hamid al-Ghazali came later on to, in fact, deepen this strain of thought. And we know as well the disputes later on, after his death, that Ibn Rushd had to defend, to challenge as well. Somebody like Ibn Taymiyyah, who has exercised the huge influence on modern Islamists. We're a little bit with the focus on Ibn Taymiyyah. He is cited everywhere in the extremist groups and is in the mainstream groups. And what he did really is he himself did a reinterpretation of major Quranic themes. Jihad, takfir, relation to non-Muslims. He coined new concepts that didn't exist in the original text, hadith, or sunnah, or Quran. For example, he used the concept of abode of Islam, Dar al-Islam, Dar salam, abode of war, Dar al-Harb, abode of unbelief, Dar al-Kufr. So, but Ibn Taymiyyah has produced a lot in jurisprudence, fiqh. He only what the Muslim Brotherhood of today refer to is a very tiny part of what he produced, 33 fatwas concerning al-jihad and the takfir, because we know the historical circumstances of that time. The Mughals were invading Syria, and they were formerly Muslims, but he wanted to make them non-Muslims and believers so that he can proclaim jihad against them. And you know, in the traditional Islamic thought, takfir is difficult, jihad is not allowed against other Muslims, etc. But what Ibn Taymiyyah did, he reinterpreted and developed this concept that the nowadays Islamists also took for granted, and they did the same thing when they had to fight different political regimes in the region. Some people may even go as far as saying that Khawarij, who are another Islamic sect, in fact, that have maybe indirectly at a very symbolic level influenced the Islamic thought, especially concerning the concept of Hakimiyya, sovereignty, and the right to rebel against the political authority. We know in the Islamic Sunni tradition, rebellion against political authority is a red line. The first Islamic group that has legitimized rebellion against political authority was the Khawarij. Okay, I would like to just come to the conclusion of this first part. First of all, Islam, which the Islamist movement attribute themselves today, is a Islam which is fragmented, which is scholastic, rigid, repetitive tradition, instead of the other trend in Islam, in classical Islam, which is vibrant, which has tremendous capacity to digest, as it did digest Greek philosophy, Indian wisdom, Persian science, etc. And this is, I'm quoting here Muhammad Arkoun. Okay. Also, the tradition that the Muslim Brotherhood situated itself in is obsolescent, and it lacks historical perspectives. As we have mentioned, if those concepts have been produced during the Ibn Taymiyyah time or during Ibn Hanbal time, they have no sense historically to our present day. And in fact, as Abd al-Jabiri would say, that is a tradition that repeats itself. And unfortunately, this tradition has been the main legitimizing corpus of the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamic traditions today. My second part of this intervention, I would like to talk about modern references, modern intellectual references, and I mean by that the thinkers of the Arab Islamic Renaissance and Nahda. We know Nahda was a cultural and political, intellectual and elitist intellectual and cultural movement that thrived in the Arab-speaking regions during the Ottoman colonization, of the Osmanic dominance at that time. The main representative of this period is Jamal al-Afghani, as I said, Muhammad Abdu, and Rashid Rida. All right, so how did those people, how did the thinkers, how did they influence the Muslim Brotherhood? Okay, first of all, if we start with somebody like Jamal al-Afghani, there's too much to say about his, we don't have time to talk about his biography or his intellectual production, but we would say that he had a distrust and he was very defensive toward the West. That is a point that the Muslim Brotherhood also took. Of course, the Nahda thinkers, they were, at the end of the day, they were also Salafist in a way. They had this DNA. That's why it has failed. You know, although it has brought some renovation, it has tried to bring responses to the relationship between Islam and modernity. But at the end of the day, it did not succeed. Also, concepts like Islamic universalism, inclusiveness of Islam, and pan-Islamic nationalism that was called by Jamal al-Afghani was also taken, some of this was taken by the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. Afghani also influenced even in some practices, not only relation to many organizational related issues. We won't talk about that because we don't have much time. We just jump to Muhammad Abdu. So Muhammad Abdu was the most open-minded of the three. He's known to have coined this slogan, Islam is the solution, Islam wal hal. And I quote him here, Islam is the way of reform. It is not, therefore, it is not right to borrow a reformist character, philosophy, or ideology from some other civilization, because Islam is sufficient, guarantees the pathway to reform. And from here came the slogan of the dear slogan to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is Islam is the solution. Another aspect of Muhammad Abdu's thought, emphasis, he emphasized on education. He started politics, didn't work. Then he said we should focus on education to bring the or to constitute a new citizen, Islamic Muslim citizen. That's exactly what the Brotherhood did at the beginning for 15 years. They were and still focusing on the Islamization from below through education. We come to Muhammad Rashid Rida. Muhammad Rashid Rida was the most conservative and traditional of the three. He was somehow contemporary to Hassan al-Banna. He died in 35. Hassan al-Banna started in 1928, that is. He had the Manar, which is one of these reviews that was quite famous at that time. We know that Al-Banna took over after the death of Rashid Rida, took over this review, quite influential. So in what he did influence the Muslim Brotherhood, as said, the Salafist principle were there. The idea of reviving the Islamic Caliphate was dear to Rashid Rida and dear to Al-Banna, of course. And we know that Al-Banna started in 28, 4 years after the collapse of the Islamic Caliphate in Istanbul, calling for jihad, and also the concept of emphasizing the inclusiveness, shumuliyat Islam, inclusiveness Islam. And the last of this strain of thought end up in the Indian subcontinent in one of the most influential Islamists who also founded something like a brotherhood organization called the Jamaat Islami in 1941, and this is Al-Mawdudi, Abdullah Al-Mawdudi. Abdullah Al-Mawdudi influenced especially Sayyid Qutb. He was like a godfather to Sayyid Qutb, and he took from him most of the conceptual the concepts that he used, like sovereignty, hakimiyya, like the jahiliyyah khususan, the reinterpretation of the word jahiliyyah, which meant the pre-Islamic, but the jahiliyyah now is applied to people who are Muslims and live in the 21st century. I think to this, I would, of course, I had to go very fast, and I would leave, any other details to the session on question and answer. And I think by this, I'm sorry to have taken maybe too long, and I'll wait for any question on any of these issues that I have mentioned. Also, I would just mention that the Brotherhood were also influenced somehow by some main concepts of the West, especially on the organization level. The organization of the Muslim Brotherhood, it looks like a communist party or a fascist party with the central committee, with the leader, and also they would use even some concepts from socialism, like social justice, al-adala al-ijtima'iyya, and many of these concepts are borrowed from the 20th century Western thought. We can explain that in details in the question and answer.
Exactly. We will touch on that definitely, because the last point that you just mentioned is something that we will definitely break down. Dr. Mohammed Farid Azi, thank you so much for this presentation. And in our next presentation, we will hear about the gap between Muslim Brotherhood ideology and its political implementation through the experiments of Egypt and Tunisia in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. We will discuss the Brotherhood's discourse nature, characterized by a dichotomy between principles and practices. So our next speaker is Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, Director of the Program on Extremism at George Washington University. Dr. Lorenzo, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Talin. I want to acknowledge Trent for organizing this very timely event and for having me. Thank you very much. Well, what I would like to discuss today, and I think Dr. Mohammed Farid gave a very extensive, despite the time limitation, overview of the Brotherhood ideology. What I would like to do is more focus on what I have been studying for the last 20 years, which is a bit of a niche part of the Brotherhood ideology, but a very important one, which is the Brotherhood in the West. I'm very happy to say that, my latest book is being currently translated by Trends. It will come out in Arabic for Trends. And indeed, I think there's a lot of importance in how the Brotherhood operated in the West over the last 50, 60 years in terms of the impact that it has had on Western discourse on Islam and Islamism in terms of shaping Muslim communities in the West, and also in terms of shaping the Brotherhood itself. I think one of the lessons of the Arab Spring, for example, was to see how many leaders of the Brotherhood that went back to Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and other countries, and for a long time lived in the West and absorbed, if not the ideology, at least the tactics, the language, the methodology of political activism of the West, from Rashid Ghannouchi to Mohamed Morsi to the current leaders of the Libyan Brotherhood. All of them spent a lot of time in the West, and that is something that is quite important. Now, for time's sake, I will provide a very brief history of the Brotherhood in the West in a minute or two. Obviously, something very difficult to do, but it's a story that starts in the 1950s and 60s when you have some of the a handful of very prominent leaders of the Brotherhood, people like Said Ramadan and Yusuf Nada, that left their countries of origin, Egypt, Syria, and other countries, and came to the West mostly as refugees. And together with them, we started to see a larger group of students from the upper middle classes of the Arab world coming to study, mostly pursuing graduate studies in the universities of the West. Now, this relatively small group of individuals created some of the first Islamic organizations in Europe and in North America. It was small at the time, but over time, they grew to be some of the most important Muslim organizations in the West. Now, I would say three factors led them to be so important. One is the ample funds they received from abroad, from a variety of countries in the Middle East. So they received money that allowed them to build mosques, to create organizations, to have all the activities that made them so prominent. The second is their activism, the fact that a lot of them are very motivated and skilled political activists. And thirdly, the freedoms they enjoyed in the West, where mostly unchecked by Western governments, they could continue the activities which they could not back in the Arab world, with basically no control and no limitations from the West. We're talking about a relatively small group of people. I think it's very important to always remember that the Brotherhood is a very selective, very elite group. You don't join easily the Brotherhood. That's true in the East as in the West. You join after a very careful vetting and selection process. So in every Western country, we are talking about a small cluster of people. I would say in the big countries like France or Germany or the UK, maybe 1,000 members, a few hundred in the small ones, but very motivated, very skilled, very well funded, and of course able to punch above their weight, to have a disproportionate influence that doesn't match their small numbers. So what is the ideology? What do they want? And of course here you start to see the differences between the East and the West. Now, of course, there's a common general worldview. Everything that Dr. Farid said in terms of how the Brotherhood sees the world, the general principles are identical between the East and the West. But obviously, a group that is pragmatic and flexible like the Brotherhood has adapted its goals to the reality of the West, where Muslims are a small minority and where obviously some of the goals of the Arab world cannot be realistically achieved. And I would say that the goals are threefold when it comes to the Brotherhood in the West. The first one is to spread their political, religious worldview to Muslim communities in the West. There's a great book written by Yusuf al-Qaradawi that presents the situation in the West as an unprecedented opportunity for the Brotherhood to operate in what it calls a virgin territory, an Islamic tabula rasa, in which they are not, the Brotherhood, the Islamic movement as it calls it, is not hampered by the regimes of the Arab world, but it has all the freedom it wants to convince fellow Muslims that their interpretation of Islam is the correct. So that's the first goal. Are they successful or not? That's debatable. I would argue that most Western Muslims reject the Muslim Brotherhood ideology, even though some ideas of the Brotherhood almost subliminally have become somewhat mainstream within Muslim communities. The second goal for the Brotherhood in the West is then to become the representatives of Muslim communities when dealing with Western establishments. Now, whether that means officially recognized by law or de facto, they want to be the gatekeepers, the main interlocutors of Western countries, the entities to which Western governments, Western media, Western elites, establishments go to when they want to engage Muslim communities, when they want to know what Western Muslims think. They obviously do not represent Muslim community, but they make, because of their ability to mobilize and present themselves in a certain way, this claim of representing Western Muslim communities. And the third goal that they seek is that of influencing Western policymaking, Western discussions and policymaking on all Islamic-related issues, whether that means in the Muslim world or domestically. So they want to be the ones that establish these close relationships with Western policymakers, media, so that they are the voices that ministers, politicians, journalists go to when they want to know about Palestine, the Gulf, any kind of development in the Middle East, or issues that relate to the Muslim community. Now, again, we can talk about whether they are successful in these goals or not. A key to all this, to all these goals, is one of the things that Dr. Farid mentioned, is the dissimulation tactic that exists with the Brotherhood. And I think that tactic is true in the Arab world, but is particularly true in the West. What do I mean by that? In the West, first of all, there's a dissimulation about even the identity of the Brotherhood. I can be in the Arab world and can meet with people who present themselves as Muslim Brotherhood. That's relatively easy to do. In the West, there's not a single individual, with maybe a couple of exceptions, or organizations that present themselves as Muslim Brotherhood. They will vehemently deny that. They will sue people who accuse them of being Muslim Brotherhood. But there's a complete dissimulation even on the identity of the structures and networks. And then to that follows a dissimulation of their beliefs. They're very careful about what they say in public. There's a double discourse and a strong effort in presenting a moderate face to the West. The book I was mentioning earlier that Trends is translating includes an interview that I did with a former member of the Brotherhood in Denmark. He's a man of Lebanese origin who joined the Muslim Brotherhood in Lebanon. And he says one thing that I find always very interesting to understand the mindset of the Brotherhood in the West. And he says, we, back when it was Brotherhood, we understood that the West is short-sighted. And it basically wants three things from us, Muslim Brotherhood: money, votes, and not being Bin Laden. And if you dissect these 3 points, it's very smart. Money, there's this argument within Brotherhood networks that the West is very materialistic and with very few transactions in terms of, for example, bringing some donation to a certain politician, being a channel for some funding from Qatar, let's say, to certain entities in the West. The West will turn a blind eye to what Brotherhood networks do. The second is votes. And I think that's another key selling point, key tactic of Brotherhood networks in the West, which is they claim to be able to deliver votes for Western politicians. And that is a currency that has a lot of value, of course. And finally, not being Bin Laden. The Brotherhood has this keen ability to present itself as the moderate alternative to groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh. Groups like Al-Qaeda and Daesh in the West for them are a blessing because they can point to them and say, look, they are the radicals, they are the problems, and we are the solution. You work with us, We know how to deal with these people. We know how to convince young people not to radicalize and join. I would argue there's a fourth selling point, which is integration. Brotherhood networks have convinced a lot of people in the West that they are the force that leads to the integration of Western Muslim communities. Now, there's a constant dual message, constant ambiguity in what the Brotherhood in the West does and say. I always find it amusing when I see Brotherhood organizations in the West having one day an event with gay rights groups, and in the same day hosting a very radical Salafi preacher who argues that homosexuals should be stoned. Not a problem for Brotherhood organizations to do, because both engagements bring them something, bring them some political currency. They want at the same time to be accepted by the political left, which they see as a natural ally, but they also want to still have their legitimacy in the most conservative cross-section of the Muslim community. They politically, they work with both right-wing and left-wing political groups, siding on on different issues. There's this constant balancing act and this constant presenting a facade, which is quite difficult to reconcile with their true nature. Now, what I do see quite a bit in Europe, in particular, over the last few years, let's say a couple of years for sure, is a radical change in the perception that most European governments have of the Brotherhood. I think that for a long time that has been a concern in several parts of the Arab world, that have seen Europeans as being very soft, very naive, as some people would put it, when it comes to Brotherhood, as tolerating the presence and the constant activities of the Brotherhood. And I think there's a slow change, but slow but very perceptible change in that, particularly in Europe. Now, of course, the Brotherhood operates for the most part within the law. So it's difficult for European countries to intervene in ways that would close down, or Tal, you were talking about designating the Brotherhood. Every country has its own process, but it's a tricky process, a tricky predicament in most Western countries to really crack down on the Brotherhood from a legal point of view. But that doesn't mean that there's not a growing understanding that the Brotherhood presents a problem in the first place to European societies. And it's a problem that is both a security problem and a social cohesion integration problem. A security problem, not so much in the sense that the Brotherhood is engaged in terrorism in Europe, in the West, it is not, but that it does provide a narrative that leads people to radicalize. It provides sort of people call it a mood music, a fertile environment for more radical groups to further radicalize people. And at the same time, its narrative is extremely problematic from an integration social cohesion point. Let me read, and then I'm mindful of my time. Let me read you a couple of quotes that come from European security services. And that tells you how the mood is changing in a lot of European countries when it comes to the Brotherhood. This is from German security German security services. And it says, among other things, the wide ranging of Islamist-oriented educational and support activities, especially for children and adolescents from immigrant families, are used to promote the creation and proliferation of an Islamist milieu in Germany. This round countered the efforts undertaken by the government to integrate immigrants. There is the risk that such milieus could also form the breeding ground for further radicalization. Austrian intelligence, in a court case from 2 years ago, the political system aimed for by the Muslim Brotherhood is reminiscent of a totalitarian system which guarantees neither the sovereignty of people nor the principles of freedom and equality. Such a fundamental position is incompatible with the legal and social norms of the Republic of Austria. This quote was used to deny asylum to the wife of a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, the very prominent one, who had applied for asylum in Austria. And that tells you quite a bit of different dynamic. And finally, again, German intelligence. In the long run, the threat posed by legalistic Islamism, which is the way that Germans call the Muslim Brotherhood, that sort of Islamism that operates within the law. The threat posed by it to the liberal democratic system is greater than that of jihadism, which will always outnumber numerically. So what we are seeing is that a growing understanding that the real threat doesn't come necessarily from jihadism, from violent groups, but it comes, that's sort of like a short-term, very problematic matter, but the long-term threat comes from brotherhood groups that have a social engineering project taking place, which is in the long term more problematic than the terrorist attacks. If you see some of the speeches that French President Emmanuel Macron gave over the last year, what Sebastian Kurz in Austria has said repeatedly, you see that the mood is changing. That doesn't really apply to, and I'm sort of sad to say that, to both the US and the UK, where the debate doesn't seem to be going in that direction, probably distracted by domestic matters, but that is sort of what's taking place in continental Europe. There's a growing understanding that the ideology and activities of the Brotherhood are highly problematic. Now, what to do about that becomes the big question. As I said, the challenge from a Western point of view is the fact that a lot of these groups, for the most part, do not engage in illegal activities. They engage in what I would call subversive activities, which for the most part are constitutionally protected activities. But there are, of course, things that are being discussed and in some cases implemented in European countries. For example, cutting foreign funding, that's what Austria has done, funding voices that are competing with Brotherhood networks. So there are a variety of experiments that are taking place. I can leave it at that. I also have to say, Tal, and you know that I have to leave in a few minutes. I apologize for that. I have another event, so I appreciate any question. And I.
Do you have time to take questions or? Okay, so Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, thank you so much. You put it out very well, very, very interesting points. And I'm not surprised about the quotes you brought from Austria. I'm a bit more surprised from the quotes you brought from Germany. So I'm a bit relieved to see that things are going the way that you described. Regarding the US, I think, I know your time is short, so we will maybe break down a potential US designation of the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization maybe a bit later, and continue with our presentations. I do know that the problem here in the US, I mean, two major problems, there's a lot, but one is that the US does not want to create more enemies by doing so, you know, if we're talking about Qatar and Turkey in that sense. And something that I told my trend colleagues, I call them now, Sumaya and Sharifa earlier, is that people here say in the United States, well, the Brotherhood is not necessarily an organization. So how do you designate it as a terrorist organization if it doesn't have a central command or a hierarchy of an organization? But as you and I know, we can also find ways to call them an organization because they do meet certain criteria. They also say it, by the way, about Antifa over here. There's right now a debate whether the president should designate Antifa as a terrorist domestic terror organization or not. And many people say, well, it is a movement. It's not necessarily an organization. So that is part of the debate. If you want to answer shortly in one sentence, and then I'll let you go, then take it away.
Yeah, well, the designation process is a complicated one in the States. There are political considerations that you mentioned, and there are indeed legal considerations. So it's complicated, and I think it's something that it's probably not going to happen over the next few months if it ever happens. But I don't necessarily see it as an either-or proposition, or it doesn't have to be an either-or proposition where you either designate or you ignore, which is the way the US is acting for the most part, at least domestically. I think, again, the way some European governments are dealing with it is that even though they stop short of designating, they're still taking actions to limit the influence of the Brotherhood. listen, in some countries, and we talked about Austria now being very aggressive, until a few years ago, Austria was funding a variety of brotherhood entities. Austria was funding entities run by brotherhood activists, which are training imams paid by the Austrian state to then teach Islam in public schools and so on and so forth. And that nonsense has stopped over the last few years. So there's several things that can be done, even if no designation takes place. And that also applies to the United States. There are several domestic groups in the States that are not designated. It doesn't mean that they are treated as mainstream, as they are, as that happens to some brotherhood networks in the United States right now.
Yeah, well, and there's a lot of lobbying happening on Capitol Hill. This is something that we can break down in a different opportunity. Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, at this point, we would like to thank you. We know your time is precious at the moment and pressing. All right, our next presentation will examine the pillars of the Brotherhood's ideological project and also highlight the remnants of its dogmatic approach that exists even today. The session will also investigate the changes that occurred in the Ikhwan project. So I'm honored to welcome Muhammad Al-Arabi, senior researcher at the Cairo School for Liberal Sciences and Arts. I don't have it.
Yes, do you have my voice now?
Here, I do have you. I don't see, oh, I do see your video now.
Okay, good. Thank you, Tal. Thank you for Trends Center for inviting me and having me today. Okay, thank you. Actually, my intervention will focus on the fundamental roots of the Muslim Brotherhood. Dr. Muhammad Farid touches on this issue, and actually I start from where he ended, especially his second part. The question I'm here to answer tonight, whether the Muslim Brotherhood or political Islam in general as an ideology and a movement is an extension of Islamic revivalism or a disruption to this movement, especially when it comes to the issue of the hostility of the Islamists toward the West. Actually, there's a mainstream, or let's say, a dominating argument in the historiography of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is presupposed that the revivalists or the Ihya'iyin, Muhammad Abdu and his teacher and patron at first, Jamal al-Din al-Afghani, and then Muhammad Rashid Rida, and many other revival Muslims, pioneers in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, that this revivalists bequeathed the hostility of the West to the Muslim Brotherhood and the political Islam. And this argument mainly based on the history, the fact that these ideologues, especially Hassan al-Banna and Abu A'la al-Mawdudi, were mainly and hugely influenced by this Ihya'iyin, the pioneer of revivalism. Mainly Rashid Rida and many other in India and Egypt. And the fact also that Muhammad Hassan al-Banna was a disciple of Rashid Rida, who was a disciple of Muhammad Abdu, and he was a political disciple of Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. Actually, traces of the hostility to the West and the critical stance against modernism that are characterizing political Islam can be found in the works of the activism of the revivalist pioneers. However, in my intervention, I argue that there is a breakup or a disruption between the revivalists and Islamists, which is a point I disagree with Dr. Muhammad Farid. This is for many reasons. Primarily, this claim is equally made by the Islamists and their opponents, both. They, for themselves, seeing themselves as extension of the great efforts made by Afghani, Rashid Rida, and Abdu, and for example, Muhammad Iqbal in India, and the many revivalists and pioneers in Tunisia, Algeria, in this area, especially when it comes to their resistance of the Western dominance and Western European colonialism. As for the opponents, they believe that there is an essential aggressive component in most of the Islamic modern thought, and that political Islamists are just a symptom to this intellectual dysfunction or disease, let's say. For me, I think this argument is ignoring several facts. The first fact that the legacy of revivalism and ihya in the Muslim world is huge and wide-ranging, and doesn't present a coherent or monolithic view of the society or the relationship between Islam and the West. This issue is depending between and actually is a matter of debate even between the Ihyaiyin themselves. The second thing that there is a dynamism and richness of the legacy of or the revivalism. It is true that Western issue casts a huge shadows over the perspective of these thinkers, but it wasn't the only issue. It was there was a need to reform the Islamic thought, the institution, the politics, the education, and that is a cause of the disruption between the political Islam and the revivalism. Thirdly, these views, including the relationship between Islam and the West, for each one of the pioneers has changed many times in different contexts. But in general, they welcomed modernism, they were reformists because they didn't, in general, tend to violent or going into revolution or any aggressive action against the West or their respective societies. They also welcome the Western progress and when it comes to the issues of sciences, arts, and embraced this modernism in various manners. So I think they were not hostile to the West per se, but it was this European expansionism and the colonialism that triggered the struggle they called for to counter the Western political influence and the authoritarian rulers in the 19th century, especially, and for them, these authoritarian rulers encouraged and befriended with the European colonizers. So we need to look into the political context and the intellectual works of these pioneers and thinkers within their specific context. Actually, in the 18th and the 19th century, the Muslim world was under a great pressure of the Western intervention and the weakness of the three great empires ruling most of the Muslim world. The Ottomans ruled from Istanbul, most of the Arab world and the Balkans, and the Qajars ruling Persia and parts of Iraq, and the Mughal Empire ruling India. This weakness and this pressure was manifested by, for example, at first the Kochi-Konarji Treaty, in which the Ottoman gave a huge capitulations to the Austrian Empire. Then the French expedition led by Napoleon to Egypt, and the successive defeats of the Ottomans in their wars with the Russians, the Austrians, and other European countries, and the capitulation treaties signed by the Qajars with the other European powers. There was also the failure of the Sepoy Mutiny against the British occupation in India, that to the end of the Mughal Islamic Empire in India and the Muslim rule in India in general. So in this era, the Muslim world and their intellectual circles was mainly dominated by the ulama. These three figures were actually ulama. They were not, they didn't have this modern education, or they weren't part of the local or national bourgeoisie. They had this tradition, upbringing, and the tradition source of view of the world. But this ulama did not lose their track of tajdeed and revivalism over centuries, because tajdeed is an essential part of Islam, as Dr. Muhammad said before. But this tajdeed was mainly focusing on the issues of aqidah and sharia and the fiqh, that is jurisprudence. What happened with the revivalist movement, led mainly by Jamaluddin Afghani, Muhammad Abdu, and then Rashid Rida, that the issue of the West became a huge matter to be discussed and to debate over. because of the Western encroachment over the Muslim world, the failure of the Arabist revolution in Egypt under the British occupation in Egypt, the French occupation of Algeria in and then Tunisia and then Morocco. Libya also fell a victim of the Italian colonialism, and so on. So for them, it wasn't also the matter of the military or the political defeat of the Muslim countries. It's also the matter of the rapid change of the lifestyle and the rapid modernization sponsored by the states and the political authorities before the coming of the occupation or the colonialism. That triggered this debate over the issue of the West, that we need to tackle this issue of modernism. How can we constitute a genuine challenge, a genuine response to this challenge? So at first we thought that we need to reform education, administration, and the military. And that happened actually under the rule of Muhammad Ali in Egypt, or the rise of Tunisia, and some reformist attempt made by the Ottoman Sultan in Istanbul. But what happened that this modernization from above to bottom failed to stand up to the European colonialism. I think this historical context is essential to highlight the fact that the revivalists were not just an extension, were just an extension of a deep-seated attempt to reform and to modernize the Muslim society. These reformers were open to adapt to the Western notion of civilization and progress through the existing balance of power and existing political institutions. I think these reformers made a pragmatic attempt to make this adaptation, and per se were not hostile to the Western notion of life and modernity as a way of based on the reason, the centrality of the state, the need to reform, and the need to make a breakup with the declining traditional ways of life in education, in military, in economy, and so on. Sayyid Jamaluddin al-Afghani was a key figure in this movement. And also he is a key to understand the evolution of the reformist tendencies and their relation to the West. Al-Afghani, a man of mysterious and debatable origin, thought first that political and institutional change are essential to resist the West. And he made many attempts to provoke the local intelligentsia and politicians and rural to do these reforms. He tried that in India, and he was engaged in a debate with Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who was a pro-British, and thought this alliance between the British and the Muslim of India can preserve the political status of Muslim community and preserve Islam in India. And for his revolutionary cause and his criticism against the British colonialism, he was expelled from India for Egypt. And he made contacts with the Arabists, the revolutionaries, and the reformists. Many of the reformists existing already in Egypt found him as a leading figure, notably Muhammad Abdu, and even the future Khedive Tawfiq, the next ruler of Egypt. But he took extreme position, as Dr. Muhammad said. He tried to, at any price, to trigger these reforms, even by the assassination of Khedive Ismail or Nasruddin Qajar in Persia. Also, he made another attempt to reform with the supply port of the ruler, the Sultan of the Ottomans, Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And actually, he urged him to take three measures. The first is to lead the Islamic unity under the banner of Khilafat, or pan-Islamism, and this is something I need to highlight also. The second is to dismantle the Ottoman positions in Europe, in Balkans especially, and to move the capital from Istanbul to Baghdad as a center of the Arab world, and to make Arabic as an official language of the Sultanate. For Jamaluddin al-Afghani, pan-Islamism was just a strategic scheme, and it was not a religious nationalism. Actually, in that time, in the 19th century, pan-Islamism, al-Haraka al-Islamiyya or Jama'a al-Islamiyya, was a variant of nationalism. The difference between these two things, Islamism and nationalism, became more obvious in the 20th century, especially with the coming of the Arab nationalism against pan-Islamism. Although Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani was revolutionary, he showed a great deal of pragmatism in dealing with this issue. For example, after the occupation of Egypt by the British, he sought a support from the French. And in India, he talked to the Hindu and called them for a unity with the Muslim against the British. So he was not moved by the identity or the thing that it is just the issue of Muslim. He seeks any attempt to resist the European colonialism. Actually, Jamal ad-Din Afghani also did not reject the Western modernization, or let's say the Western notion of modernism. And he was not a fundamentalist. Actually, he just left a few writings. So it is very hard to say that he was a fundamentalist. Also, and this is an important thing, in comparison to the Muslim Brotherhood or the modern political Islam, Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani went across the sectarian and ethnic differences of the Arab world. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, it is said, he has a Shia origin, but he preferred to present himself as a Sunni just to be more engaged with the most of the Muslim world. But he did not stress this issue. He also, when it comes to the issue of al-Aqidah or his religious thought, he was just against the anti-religious tendencies in the Western civilization. For example, he wrote a treatise called The Refutation of the Materialists, or Ar-Radd ala Dahriyin. So he just adopted the modernism just to strengthen the Muslim societies, just as a way of resisting the European colonialism. To highlight the flexibility and pragmatism of reformists, we need also to tackle the issue of Muhammad Ali, Muhammad Abdu. Muhammad Abdu was an exemplary case in this issue. Muhammad Abdu, an Azhari scholar who was trained and educated in Al-Azhar al-Sharif in Egypt. And so he had a first-hand experience of the decline and the deterioration of the traditional Islamic institution as a reflection of the decline of the Muslim society at large, and in comparison to the progress that was happening in the West. So at first he joined the revolutionaries led by Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, and he was, as I said, he was one of his disciples in Egypt. But after the defeat of the Arabists, Abdu believed that the gradual and social reform, not the revolution, is the best answer to the European challenge. When Abdu broke with Afghani, he was also obsessed with the issue of education. So he returned to Egypt and sought a refuge and auspices of Lord Kuruma, the British ruler of Egypt. And he focused most of his efforts to reform education, this is an important issue also, to reconstruct the religious thought and create a modernized version of Islam through the critical adoption of the Western notion of the power of the reason over the imitation al-aql ala al-naql. Also, Muhammad also was very influenced by the Islamic tradition of al-kalam, that was mainly based on the issue of the reason over the supremacy of the reason over the imitation. Abdu also urged the ulama of Algeria and other colonized or occupied countries to focus their efforts on the social and cultural change instead of taking the path of revolution. So it wasn't the issue of the matter of hostility to the West that motivated the reformers, but rather the question of how to resist the aggression of the West. Their answer to this question was not the same answer. They showed a great deal of dynamism and pragmatism in seeking these answers. Back to the question, to what extent these reformers influenced the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, I think that Dr. Muhammad said that Hassan al-Banna was hugely influenced by these reformers. This is true. I don't disagree with that. But the thing that for me, I think Hassan al-Banna and Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi and other Islamist pioneers and activists adopted a reductionist version of revivalism. For example, they adopted the pan-Islamism and made it a religious nationalism. And so this pan-Islamism is the only way to achieve the long goal of the restoration of the caliphate. And restoring also the glory or the first decades of Islam. But actually they ignored the huge efforts exerted by the revivalists to design a social and political reform. So they just were selective in their picking of the Islamic revivalism. Also, they made a great break with the revivalism or the Ihya when they shifted the politics from the politics of reform to the politics of the identity. This caused a notion of nativism that is dominating most of the Islamist narrative and discourse even today. Even we are talking the Brotherhood of Egypt or across the Arab world, or even the Muslim Brotherhood group in Europe and the West. This nativism, for myself, is the main cause of the hostility of the Brotherhood and political Islam of the West. This nativism is based on the belief that there is an internal enmity between the Muslim world, Dar al-Islam, and the West, which is Dar al-Harb. So colonialism, for example, was not an historical dynamic of the Western economic expansion or the political influence of the European power, but just a war against Islam. The second, that they believe the modernism is not a danger, just a danger to the political autonomy of the Muslim world. It is also a danger to the identity or the system or the essence of the Muslim world, the imagined essence or identity, of course. And lastly, it pertains that they believe that supremacy of the believers and the messianic ultimate victory over the non-believer or the West or any non-Muslim community. This is basically manifested in Sayyid Qutb Islamist writing, especially Ma'allim ala al-Tariq or his interpretation of Quran, fi Zil al-Quran. And as Dr. Muhammad said also, Sayyid Qutb was mainly influenced by Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi in India, but also Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi was very affected by the fact that he was in Pakistan, which is a project of religious nationalism. So it was Sayyid Qutb and other figures of this Muslim Brotherhood that promoted this nativism. And by the way, you can't find the writings of Muhammad Abdu or Jamal al-Din al-Afghani or Rashid Rida as a part of the indoctrination process in the Muslim Brotherhood and the other radical group. It is Sayyid Qutb, mainly Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, Abu al-Hasan al-Nadwi, and to lesser extent some of the modern Islamic sympathizer intellectual, as the case in Egypt. But they are not influenced by Abdu and Jamal al-Din al-Afghani. So to come to conclusion that although the Islamists and Brotherhood claim the legacy of the reformists of Muhammad Abdu, Rashid Rida al-Afghani is their own, and they themselves as an normal extension of their legacy, they hardly admit their influence. So for us to dismantle these ideological claims by the Islamists, we need to look closely and examine the geopolitical and social necessities of the Islamic source and the dynamics of change and continuity without accepting these easy digesting simplistic arguments proposed by the Islamists and their opponents. So I leave it here, and I thank you for this opportunity.
Muhammad Al-Arabi, thank you so much for this breakdown. So we will finish now with, we won't finish, I mean, there's one more presentation, and then we have so many questions you keep writing to us, and we would love to address everything that I'm receiving here. We would do our best to address all these comments and questions. But before we get to the Q&A, we would like to finish with a a look onto the future of the Muslim Brotherhood's ideological and political projects. And to do so, we are also joined today by our honorable guest that I'm very lucky to introduce to you, Dr. Abdul Munaim Said Ali. He is the chairman of the board and director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies in Cairo. And he's also the chairman of the board at Al Masri Al-Yawm Publishing House, joining us from Egypt.
Thank you very much, Tal. Thank you all. I have learned a lot in the past hour or so. And let me start my presentation to you from the end. So at least if I was cut off sometime, then my major message will be delivered. We have an organization that's living for 90 years. It has a lot of ups and downs in its existence. And certainly, its major trajectory is the ability to spread. It is an international organization. It has chapters in about 81 states of the world. And although I agree totally that they have, at the present time, a lot of setbacks and a lot of contraction. However, as I will try to tell you why later, that they will be around us for a long time. That is because basically they are what I will call it a very totalitarian organization. Totalitarian organizations are fascists and communists of different sorts. Usually they have an ideology that's global, that's an ideology that is discriminate, that it looks at all others as wrong and all ours are right. In many ways, they have a lot of racial view of the world that believe that certain types of thinking is the right one. And their message is to deliver that one. And that was probably, I will agree that it was one of the responses to the downfall of the Caliphate in 1924. I will agree about many of what Dr. Farid talked about the origins, but I will say that as all totalitarian organizations, the Muslim Brothers are an ideology, an organization, and a plan of action. And these three levels, I will, handle them. The ideology is coming out of the third Islamic political thought school. We have the Shia people who believed that God must choose in the family of Muhammad, because of its righteous living to deliver his message. And these are the Shia people. And those who thought no, that the ummah that Muhammad left with Sunnah and tradition is actually should be dependent on what they call it Ahl Sunnah or Al-Jama'ah and the will of the community and the followers of the Prophet. And finally, the most extreme one was the Khajrites, or Khawarij. Al-Khawarij are a big brand that lived through 1,000 years or more. And they have been there. Sometimes they went up, they went down, and they have always a political agenda is to get to power. Like others, like the Shia get to power and the Sunnah get to power. So this origin means in the modern day, of the Muslim Brothers, Al-Hakimiyya. Al-Hakimiyya is only the word of God that should be implemented. And the principle of allegiance and obedience, which is very crucial for the organization, and jihad, which is a kind of innovation, because in many ways, God asked us to obey him, and also he asked us to do a number of things, like praying, fasting, pilgrimage, and so forth. Ironically, the word jihad was not in the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. But also in the modern Muslim brother is the inevitability of confrontation with the other. This other might be the West, might be the Israelis, might be the communists and the Chinese, all people who are not adherents to what they adhere to. And they added lately, on the time of Sayyid Qutb, the principle of takfir without excuse, which something means, in the ordinary type of religion, if somebody made something wrong, then he can say he was excused because he was sick, he was mad, he was whatever. No, there is no excuse if anybody, disobeyed what God has asked us to do. So this is, the pillars of the ideology. But for me, the most important thing is the totalitarian organization. That is usually, it has a supreme guide and a council for guidance, and also masses of soldiers and people who are asked absolute total allegiance and obedience. Those people are, using not only political means, but also terrorism or acts of violence. As all fascist groups, totalitarian groups, except they have a number of strategies that they developed over the years, and it is in many of the Muslim Brothers' books, which actually differentiate between two sides of action. One in the time of weakness and the one in the time of empowerment. So if you are in the time of weakness, you speak softly, in modern day times or contemporary times, talking about moderation, liberalism, elections, and all sorts of things that really are said in English differently from what it is in Arabic or in Arab countries and Muslim countries. Because the goal is to reach the empowerment, which means completely how to reshape the society in the forms regarding here women, regarding minorities, regarding how to structure. I mean, we experienced that in Egypt, and fortunately the acumen of the Egyptian people was enough that only 1 year and in power, and it was obvious that the civic nature of the Egyptian state is going to change to be completely like the Iranian one. Although they are Shia, but the idea of supreme guide, and which means the supreme dictator and the supreme council, and a council over the councils to make sure that that the ideology is implemented. So we have here, this kind of division between weakness. In Tunisia, Al-Nahda is getting into the election process, but in the meantime, always they are putting people on the test of either they are true Muslims or they are compromising their Islamism. They work in a number of issues like trying to put people in shapes, from the time they get into the bathroom to the time they get out of it, getting into the elevator, getting out of it, all the, practices that make the man every second is linked with the supreme guide, of course, God himself, or the supreme guide of the Muslim brothers. But the most dangerous thing they do is they are the major incubator of terrorist making. All the famous names, Muhammad Atta, Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, all the famous names in the world of terrorism are spend some time in the incubators of the Muslim Brothers. That is the major school of working to implement the ideology they are trying to do. More than they are incubators, they are also the mobilizers. Mobilizers of what? Most of all money. The Muslim Brothers, usually the most richest organization we knew in Egypt, in any Arab country, in any Muslim country, and we'll assume in any Western countries that has Muslims. They worked very hard. I mean, traditionally, most of the Islamic centers in the United States, North America as a whole, Europe, was coming from Al-Azhar in Egypt, the traditional school of thought in Egypt. Then Saudi Arabia took over in the 1970s after the oil boom. And then starting from the 80s, gradually, most, and I can claim most of the mosques, Islamic centers in North America and Western Europe are controlled by the Muslim Brothers. In Germany, in Berlin, in London, they are very influential and they are very much ready to give the Westerners what really would like to hear. They are for elections and they are, however, they won't hesitate a moment. I mean, to like Hamas and among the Palestinians, they are willing to split the country to two countries in order to make their either they win, they rule, or nobody else. So here they are incubators. They are organized, people who are, capable of mobilizing money and establishing banks. And sometimes at once there was advertisements in Egypt about banks in the Cayman Islands where there is no taxes are paid. And in the meantime, they are the best users of the media. They are quite, well, and they don't mind here using the whole expertise in the West to really build modern time media, whether it's a print media or television media or electronic media, as we might now can see their sites all over the world. So here, this organization is the one that's really trying now to surpass the difficult times of the post-Arab Spring period in which the Muslim Brothers ruled in Egypt. Before that, they were ruling in the Sudan. They were the first group of politicians who started in Afghanistan and in other places in which they have chapters trying to play politics, and sometimes they play war. In the Egyptian experience and the history of the Muslim Brothers, always since the late 1930s and 1940s, they established what they call a special apparatus. That is, usually when you make the men of politics who will talk elections and talk dialogue and spread the word, and those who are ready to use violence, that assassinated a prime minister and security big officer in Khazindar in the late 1940s, tried to assassinate Nasser in 1954. Later on, I mean, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, actually, when there was the Arab Spring, all those in Tahrir Square, by the third day of the upheaval, the Muslim Brothers were ready, to provide the squares of Egypt with something called Group 95, which people were armed, trained, ready to control the ins and the outs of the squares, and attempting by force to open prisons and set fire at police stations, churches, and public buildings, shopping malls. All these happened by people, not just because of their anger. There wasn't one of them, of the early people from the January movement, the people who started the uprising. However, once they got control of it, they controlled the writing of the constitution, which very much similar to whatever rules that they are there in Iran, and reflecting very much, by the way, a program that the Muslim Brothers made earlier in 2007. in which they were talking totally about a theocratic state. Now, to just say, what type of confrontation it is possible to deal with the Muslim Brothers nowadays. I will say there is at least two strategies that are there, and everyone whether in Egypt or in other countries try to make a mix of them. The two are it is a security resistance. I mean, that is a kind of a war with terrorism, and as such, there is also the ideas of just getting them into prison, into court, into a process in which to put them out of the public and political field. The second, which is called renewal of religious thinking, which means is to open the book of Islam once more and make the ijtihad and know really what Ibn Taymiyyah said, or Al-Afghani said, or Muhammad Ali said, and what has really happened during the times of the Prophet, that really say, don't force anyone to get into the religion. I mean, there are, as all religions in the world, there are that kind of, pushing people to be believer, or, to give them the choice. You can find both. So renewal of religious thinking is another strategy. I believe personally that there is a need about a third strategy. And this third strategy is dependent on what kind of national projects are, can take people into a new ideal or into a new, kind of thinking that will not be, susceptible to the Muslim Brothers kind of thinking. I will set 3 principles of that type of thinking. One is to make life much more important than death. Second, to make progress much more important and instead of salvation. Number 3 is to make evolution is instead of creation. I mean, these kind of philosophical points that I suggest is very important, and I see some elements of it growing in the region now. I mean, what the Saudis are doing, for instance, they are trying to establish a nation state. I mean, for the first time, here we are all, the Arab side of this panel is really know that Saudi Arabia, history starts with Islam. Before, a few years ago, there wasn't any talk about, ancient relics, ancient temples, ancient statues. It is the discovery of history and also the rediscovery of geography. You put them together, you get into the beginning of a nation state. A nation state usually much longer than religion, much more persistent to make life to its people than just to get sold out to a group of people who can really make death is much better and essential than life. I will stop here and we can start the discussion if you like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Abdul Munaim. So I have many questions here. I don't think we will be able to address all of them, but I will try to maybe connect some topics together and just open it. You are welcome to unmute yourself, because I think I will just throw the question, and each one of you, if you have a follow-up, if you would like to address, just let us know. So here's something that I find pretty interesting. Unfortunately, Lorenzo is not with us for the Q&A. Somebody asked us, to what extent does the Muslim Brotherhood exploit its rights of political association and fundraising in Western countries? And should Western countries treat the Muslim Brotherhood as a political or a security problem? One aspect of this question, which I find very interesting, is how can Arab countries ensure that Western countries, Western societies deal with their concerns of the Brotherhood? So it all connects to the Brotherhood and the West and what to do about it. Who would like to address it?
I like to address it because actually we here in Egypt have been calling on Western countries for a long time, particularly the British and other countries. You got to make this organization as terrorist organization.
President Sisi went to the White House. His last visit, I think he brought it up again with President Trump.
You know, President Trump got the message, but he failed to make it through the Congress. And that's because they think it is a free of expression issue. Actually, they are always a secret organization. I mean, I doubt very much that others, they are not discovering that. I mean, if we traced anyone, because they work with the logistics of terror and the financing of terror and the recruitment and the incubator of terrorists. However, I will say, you don't have to look only on the ones you have. You can look at what they did in Egypt, what they did in Palestine, what they did in Pakistan, what they did. In a way, when you have an organization that has a global reach like this one, with who has a bank account? I mean, where is the money? I mean, that is, I doubt very much that the taxes of the Muslim Brotherhood are more monitored than the taxes of President Trump. Yeah, I mean, these people, you know, I think that the West, of course, I mean, I think we can agree that all Islamophobic things are you know, like any kind of phobic we can talk about is disgusted and not accepted. But that is something, and an organization called the Muslim Brothers. And by the way, their kids, many of the kids that are now speaking in the Washington think tank areas are really from fathers and families that came either through Canada or other places and carrying basically this message of the Muslim Brothers on the time of weakness. And as such, they are raising, the opposition or carrying the opposition to their home countries in Washington and in the United States.
I think you touched on a very interesting point. You said Islamophobia. And when I'm thinking about it, probably there's this, dilemma in the West. On one hand, you have the Muslim Brotherhood. So, I mean, as an Israeli, Israeli Jewish journalist, I know it very well because sometimes there's a will to criticize the state of Israel or the government's actions, but then people in the West think that this will be presumed as an anti-Semite position. And I guess that what you're pointing to, Dr. Abdul Munaim, is that sometimes even if there is a will in the West to criticize or to address the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood and its prevalence in Western societies, then people are apprehensive about it because they think they might be perceived as Islamophobes. Dr. Munaim, I see you're nodding, so maybe you would like to take it away.
Well, I agree. I just, my colleagues can speak. I have a few points to say about this point,
Okay. Just unmute yourself, Mohammed and Dr. Mohammed Fareed. You guys are muted.
Yeah, okay. And I think this is a very sensitive issue in Europe. While I lived in France, and then, of course, this amalgam of between, because a country like France has about 6 million Muslims, and usually these issues get mixed together, and the French themselves or the European authorities have also local issues, really, and they have elections, and they usually did not, because this issue has been there for quite some time, really, and they never took definite position about it, because they have, because what happens is French they say marché de dupes. I mean, this is like a market between a city like Paris has big outskirts where a lot big Muslim community live, and social problems in these regions, they sometimes themselves use the Muslim Brotherhood to keep these places calm. And this is for political reasons or for social political reasons. So at one point of time, they had this double game themselves. They know, of course, they know who is who. I mean, you wouldn't imagine that the security, huge security apparatus, they wouldn't know who is who. Well, but for local issues, for political, very much related to the country, they may use the Muslim Brotherhoods in this exchange, really. But I think, as Dr. Mu'alim and Dr. Lorenzo they were talking, and since 2 years ago, they have really seen the danger of all this, and that they are putting new strategies, and they know where the incubator is, as Dr. Mu'alim said. And I think there's a change in style, now the beginning of change in the European community. You cannot use this in local political issues any longer, because things are going out of proportion and out of control. Thank you.
I have a few questions regarding the future, if I'm interpreting them correctly. So one person asks us, how can we read the Brotherhood's ideology in light of the growing talk about post-Islamism and the modernization and secularization it involves? And we also have something that, another question that corresponds with it, which is, will the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood in governments, in government in Egypt and other countries drive the group to renew its ideological makeup? So can the Muslim Brotherhood reinvent itself and then maybe, theoretically, address more audiences at a time of secularization and when the discourse about a post-Islamism is it possible?
I think what the Tunisian Nada trying to do is of course, as the Dr. Mu'alim was saying, they are now in a position of weakness. And because seeing what happened in Egypt, they retracted back. And they tried at the same time, what they did, they differentiated while they split the Dawah part of the movement and the political party, and they're trying at the same time to bring into, to moderate and everything. There is a trend of thought talking about post-Islamism and seeing that the Islamists, if they have to renew themselves, like a Christian social democracy. There is this trend of thought among academia, I would imagine. But I really don't see any renewal. The Egyptian Brotherhood, this is not the first time that it had this setback, and they never changed. They had it in the 40s, they had it with Nasser, and many times, but this dogma that is like a heavy thing, I don't see any changes in this. So here there are, of course, many explanations, but myself, I don't think they would ever put into question their dogmatic outlook.
So another person here asks us to this point, why has the Muslim Brotherhood project failed in managing the ruling system when they reached to power in Egypt during Morsi's presidency, even though their project had existed for about 90 years? So how do you explain the failure?
They never have a project for progress, for building the country, for dealing with its basic problems. They don't have a solution to the increasing population. Actually, they were encouraging it, as birth control and birth organization considered something against the will of God. And their ideas is still there on the Egyptian people. I believe we have some of the attempts to include them. I mean, like we have Tunisian experience, Moroccan experience. There, they are, noticing that the balance of power with the seculars in these countries is not in their favor. They rely on the countryside for the votes. They rely on the poor areas for the votes. And they use all, NGOs kind of help to try to get these people and conditioning them, to behave in a certain way, vote in a certain way. But the results, as we see, Tunisia is growing less than half of what Egypt is growing. Second, it is the biggest country in the Arab world that produced terrorists. In the same time. Among the ISIS groups, there was about 5,000 coming from Tunisia, 300 from Egypt, 250 from the United States.
I think what you're mentioning right now is very underreported and very overlooked by the West in a sense.
And always, there are areas in which they cannot hide, how to deal with women issues. They are here, it's not the issue of the hijab or being virtual or something like that, but in terms of women working or women, being capable of addressing others to ideas and innovations. Their position from Christians, their position, we have one of the biggest jokes was a conference they made it on television on how to deal with Ethiopia, and regarding the water issue, and everyone started to make his own, war strategy. They play very much on the feelings and also try to talk and discourse with the worst possible things that can people get into in looking at others. Look at what they say on what Erdogan did regarding the Hagia Sophia mosque. That is a way of conditioning, that also the Muslim brothers, Erdogan is also, although Turkey for a long time has been seriously secular, and sometimes secular on the French tradition of being anti-religion, more being, just, trying to separate between the state and the church or the mosque in that matter. But Erdogan is taking Turkey back in terms of trying to because the Hagia Sophia was the idea was to have a place for tourism because it was originally a cathedral, during the Byzantine times. And then, later on when the Ottomans came, they make the church a mosque. And then Ataturk, which is a true secular guy, made it a museum. He did better than the Spaniards who moved mosques into Catholic churches. However, that happened. Now they are trying to get back gradually in Turkey itself. Of course, the peace treaties now in Afghanistan, good portion of it, the Taliban are trying to be like the Muslim Brothers. Getting into the Rabbani people and those who are originally Muslim brothers to make, the peace in Afghanistan. In Syria, there was a setback to the Nusra people, but there is an advance to Muslim brothers in Syria. So, of course, Hamas, it has a veto vote on how Palestinian politics can, advance itself to deal with the new realities in the region.
Yeah, and we did not even mention Libya yet. But our time is getting short, and I would like to give each one of you just a minute to conclude and maybe to wrap up your thoughts and then what your take or what you wish that people take away with them today from your presentation and from this discussion. Who would like to begin? Mohammed Farid?
Yeah,
maybe?
I just would like to conclude that the whole project, intellectual, ideological project of the Muslim Brotherhood was based on a utopia, really. And basically, the weakness of the failure, as you were saying, their failure, the different dimensions of their failure, political or else, lies somehow and into their perceptions, into the worldview, really, where everything is amalgamated together, everything is put together. You cannot survive, you cannot win, you cannot govern with this state of mind, with this ideology that is very utopic and totalitarian, as Dr. Munaim was saying, into a modern political world. And it has proven many times that is impossible. People have not differentiated yet the modern political thought, differentiate between what is political, what is religious, what is economic. And when you have this hardcore of their beliefs, mixing everything together, there is no room for politics. Everything is the fadila, is the virtue. You rule by virtue. This is not the way you do politics in the modern world. So this is meant to collapse and meant to failure.
Mm-hmm. I hear you. And I'm thinking in so many different directions about communism and utopia and so many things that we are discussing.
The Leninist one and the other one.
Pretty similar. Muhammad, that's good. I don't want to cut you off. Muhammad Al-Arabi, something that you would like to wrap up the discussion with.
Yes, this is frustrating, but I have to say that the Islamic jihadists, the political Islam in general, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, I think they will stay around the corner for a long while, as long as we have in the region the problems of social crisis, political crisis, also the issue, also the, let's say, we have problem, a deep-seated problem between the Muslim societies and Arab society and the West for many reasons, especially the issue of occupation of Palestine is going on, and this is something we need to dismantle also one of the basic premises of the Muslim Brotherhood project. Also, they think that this will be true for a long time, but at the same time, the Muslim Brotherhood will not develop anymore. Dr. Abdul Manab Said know that the so-called Muslim intelligentsia they do not exist in Egypt, for example. The Islamic current, the Islamic movement in Egypt, and from the era of Rashid Rida and Hassan al-Banna, did not produce any solid and genuine idea that can tackle the issue of the state as a project, of the society as a project, how to deal with the issue of the economy, how to deal with the issues of post-Islamism, let's say, how can we deal with the liberal values, how can we deal with the globalized world. So unless their discourse, which can be interpreted in many ways, they don't have this genuine intellectual process. For myself, I think that the main reason for this non-development or the, let's say, stagnation, intellectual stagnation, is the lack of this intelligentsia. We had many attempts in Egypt, especially in the young generation before the 2011 revolution. We have some like new Islamists, new young brotherhood, but once we have a confrontation between the state and the brotherhood, they went back to their own first place. That is because of the intellectual stagnation. So we need to do that. They will stay as long as we have a present, but they will not change.
And not only stagnation, I think we talked about today the anti-brotherhood sentiment that is developing in some countries in the West that Lorenzo pointed out to, but of course across the Middle East. And this goes hand in hand with the anti-Iran, anti-radical Shiite, momentum that we're recognizing across the region. I think that Abdul Munaim, this is something that you talked about a bit earlier. Putting together Muslim Brotherhood and somehow Iranian ideology in the same box.
There is all trends among different sects of Islam, like different sects of Judaism or Christianity. Yeah. Usually they enhance each other. There is a discourse, although sometimes they fought each other in history, but right now they are into a kind of an alliance in many ways. And this alliance is in my opinion, is to prevent the current attempt to reforming the region, reforming the region by peace, reforming the region by having a serious developmental plans. Usually looking at the countries in the region come from a number of schools. One, the liberal school, which looks at human rights, where they are, if anybody expressing himself or not. So the Muslim Brotherhood should be included in everything. There is, of course, the religious view that my colleagues here talked about its origin, from where it came. And I think the developmental type of thinking, which put us on the experience of countries like South Korea, like Singapore, like Taiwan. I mean, many countries in the world that already succeeded, they have their own religion. And all religions in many ways can be a kind of moral. We talk about one God and talk about a kind of accountability. The Egyptians made that 7,000 years ago, the idea of, a creator of, but the most important thing is about the evolution, the growth, the potential of people to be fulfilled. That needs a lot of hard work, a lot of better use of the resources of the region, and also a lot of fighting of ideas that try to drag people 14 centuries ago. And that is not only unique to Muslims. We got to keep that clear. I mean, the evangelical people in the United States are no less worse. And we have even, people in Israel is the same on the very right wing. Even during the Corona thing, they want to, isolate themselves in a certain way because they fight viruses in their own way, not like the rest of the society. So countries are plagued sometimes with this kind of extremist ideas. And we are famous in this era because it was quite a spread. I mean, the last decade was totally unmerciful with our region and countries like Syria, like Iraq, like Libya, Yemen. We are fortunate in Egypt that the whole thing did not stay for too much, I guess because of the power of nationalism in the country and the ability to recover quickly from that. But we're still suffering because they are dragging people. Of course, there are geopolitical results for that, what Turkey is doing, Iran is doing, and others are doing. So here, if the West want a message, it is, these are not moderate liberal people. Please don't, they are not. And the issue for them is just to accept equality with others, not to benefit. Here in the time of weakness was all, the good side of Western civilization, while in their intrinsic ideology, they think that the Western ideology is actually delinquent, that they are just naked women, they are people who are really violating everything that God is asking them to do.
On that note, on behalf of Trends, I would like to thank all of you for participating in today's fascinating discussion. I learned a lot personally. I appreciate your perspectives and your insight and all of your expertises. So Dr. Muhammad Farid Azi, Dr. Lorenzo Vidino, who was with us earlier, Muhammad Al-Arabi, and Dr. Abdul Munan Said Ali, thank you so much. And there's still, of course, much to discuss regarding the Brotherhood and this topic. So before we wrap it up, I would like to invite everyone to a second E-Symposium on the topic titled Muslim Brotherhood and the Struggle Against the Nation State. It will take place on Tuesday, October 20th at 7 p.m. UAE time. So see you soon, everyone. And again, thank you. I'm Tel Heinrich in New York.
Thank you, Tal.
Thank you, everyone.